Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I want to show all of you how to export your pixel art from Aseprite and import it into the Unity engine so that you can use them inside of your game. So in the first export, I'm going to be doing these static single frame assets, and then in the next export we'll work on this animated character. So as you can see, there's many frames here, but in the first one, it's just a single frame. So if you're going to be exporting a asset pack like this, and you have any kind of background that you're using so that you can see your items easier, you should go ahead and disable that. So what you should be left with is transparent backgrounds if you need to have a transparent background. So for tiles like these, you might just have everything inside of the tile filled with colors. But if it's another object like a tree or an axe or a stone, you're probably going to have some transparency. So that's your checkered background over there. So let's go ahead and export. I'm going to go up to File and then Export. And then you'll see here the chance to give it a name. So I'm going to get rid of this extra information and let's just do .png. Going to resize it to 100% because I don't want to scale this pack up. So layers, visible layers. So this will not include any hidden layers like the background layer. And before we export, let's choose the location on our computer. So in my folder for all my Unity projects, I'll export it to a new project. So let's create the new project in Unity real quick. I'll open up Unity Hub and do new project using the latest version of the editor. In this case, I'm using the beta version. So I'll do 2D URP, Universal Render Pipeline, configured for 2D renderer. I'll navigate for the location and let's jump into this tutorial folder, select the folder, give it a project name. So I'll call it Export from Aseprite, create project, and then go ahead and open it up once it's done being created. Okay, so here I have the Unity project open. I like to put all my art assets into a single folder, so I'm going to right click in the project window and choose create and then folder. I'll call this art and let's open this up. So this is where I'll export from Aseprite. So back in Aseprite, I'm going to go into the tutorials folder. Okay, actually looks like we have to redo the export menu because it doesn't realize the folder's there. So, and then let's go to Unity, tutorials, export from Aseprite, assets, art, and let's export it here. Note that it needs to be a PNG file for the transparency to be maintained. So let's export that there. And now let's open that up in Unity. So here we have the art file. If you expand right here, you'll see that it's being interpreted as a single sprite, which is not what you want because this is obviously a pack. So I'm going to click on it and over in the inspector, you'll see sprite mode single. You want to change that to multiple. Depending on how big you're making the grid for, depending on how many pixels you want every unit on your grid to be in the game, you might change this to a different number. Lately, I've just been leaving this as the default of 100 pixels per unit because you can still scale the camera size up and down regardless of this. And 100 pixels per unit is pretty easy to understand. So the other important things, change filter mode from bilinear to point and compression from normal quality to none. Hit apply, and then that will make it be represented as pixel art properly. And the last thing we're going to need to do is to cut up the sprite sheet. So click on Sprite Editor, and then where it says Slice, click Slice, go from Type Automatic to Grid by Cell Size, and you can see how big the grid is represented down here. So I made this art at 16 by 16 pixels, so that's what we need the pixel size to be. So 16 by 16. And then go ahead and hit slice. And now all of the frames that actually have some information in them are going to be cut into their own separate sprites. And you can see that with this method, the items that are bigger than 16 by 16 are going to be composed of multiple tiles. And that's okay if you're going to be laying all this down on the tile map. You might do things a little differently if you are, say, taking a tree and making it its own separate object. Let's go ahead and hit apply. Then if we expand the art, you can see everything is now its own separate frame. So for tiles like this, generally you're going to put it down on a tile map. So I can right click on the scene, go down to 2D object, tile map, and then let's do rectangular. So to draw on this tile map, we're going to need a tile set. So go to window and then go down to 2D, tile palette. And here, and I'll drag this window right next to the inspector. That's where I like to put it. We can create a new palette. So the palette, I'm going to have this save in the art folder. So I'm going to click create new palette and I'll just type the name of the pack, Gatherer Explorer, and let's go down to cell size. Okay, and then let's click create, and I'll save this in the art folder. So for each art piece that you're going to be drawing, you need a separate tile object in Unity for that, and that's going to create a whole lot of different objects. So I like to put them in a separate folder. So in the art folder, I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a new one, and I will call this Gather Explorer Tiles. And now over here in the tile palette, I'm going to zoom out, control middle mouse wheel out. Let's expand this a little bit. And then let's just drag this entire PNG into here to create the tiles. So I'll let go and it'll say generate tiles into folder. Let's generate it into Gather Explorer Tiles and then hit choose. And it's going to create the tile assets. Okay, so we have all of our tiles here. You can click on one and draw it, but you'll see that the tile squares don't actually match what we would expect drawing from the palette. And that's because we need to turn down the size of each tile on the tile grid, I believe. So go to inspector and then select the grid as well. Cell size, we need to make this scale down to our pixel size. So the default for our asset pack is that the pixels per unit is 100, which means that for the grid, a cell size of 1 is 100 pixels, but we have 16 pixels. So we need to scale that down. So that would be 0.16, as in 16 pixels out of 100, for both the X and the Y. So if you do that, now we can scroll in, and you'll see that the frame of our tile palette drawing now matches the grid, which is good. So if I click on some tiles, I can fill them in nicely here. Select a different tile, and then you can put them as well. Won't really get into the detail about drawing out your tile map, but that's kind of the idea there. Just as a quick tip on your tile map, not the grid, but the tile map, if you do want these to be collision tiles, then add a component, a Tilemap Collider 2D, and then that'll make it so that these actually block movement. But these are obviously ground tiles, so I'm going to Control Z undo that. So that's how you would bring in a Tilemap Pack and use it inside of your game. Let's go ahead and bring in a character. So in Aseprite, let's go over to this other tab, and you can see that I have a character with setup animations. So we want to export all of these as a single sprite sheet. So when you have all of these animations here and you want to export them, the way to do it is going to be to go to File, Export Sprite Sheet. But then over here on the Sprite tab, there's this option here, Split Tags. You're going to want to check that so that when you have your animations tagged, like I did before, that it's going to separate your different animations into their own separate rows. So this is really important for making it easy to know where your animations start and end when you're trying to edit them in Unity. Otherwise, if you just did something like layout and then packed, you wouldn't exactly know where one animation starts and when it ends, even though this is kind of space efficient. So you could do packed and then do split tags. So that's why the way to go for a character like this is going to be by rows and then check split tags. And then even if your animations aren't the same number of frames, you'll know exactly which row is for which animation. So now let's go to export, output file, and you're going to want this as a PNG so you get that background transparency. And then let's export that into the same project, export from Aseprite. Let's go into the art folder and I'll save it here. I'll call it character.png. Just make sure not to override your other art and then export. So now in Unity, we're going to have that character. So this is a sprite sheet, so we need to split it up. It's not sprite mode single, but multiple. And then we need to make sure filter mode is point and compression is none. So apply all of that. Now let's go into the sprite editor. And then we need to slice the sprite sheet. So these characters are going to have a higher size. So if you do grid by cell size, you need to know exactly how big each frame is. Another way of doing it would be by row and column count. So we can see we have 4 rows and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 columns. So if we do by cell count and we do, let's see, 13 for column, 4 for row, and slice, then we'll get a perfect split for all of these animations. So let's go ahead and hit apply. Okay, and close out that sprite editor. Now to create a sprite representation of the character, let's go ahead and expand this art pack and let's grab the character just kind of standing there and move it into the scene. So if I drag this here, the character is standing there in the background. We can't see it because of the ordering in the scene. So I'm gonna drag a standing frame of the character into the scene. We can't really see him because of the sorting in layer. So if we go to the grid tile map, or the tile map actually, we could add a new layer here, sorting layer. I'm gonna add a layer and let's call it ground. So add new layer, ground. Click on the tile map, change the sorting layer to ground. You could also play around with the order and layer. That would also work. It seems like the ground is still showing on top. So let's go back to add sorting layer. And I think I need to reorganize the ground to be below the default. So the default, I could just use that for the main character. I think that makes sense. So now to add a simple looping animation to this player character, let's do add component. I'll do an animator. And then we need an animator runtime controller. So generally I would put that in another folder. So I'll go to the assets, I'll right click, create a folder, and let's just call it character here. Double click into it, and let's right click, create a new animation controller. I'll do AC player. Okay, so now let's drag this into the slot for animator controller. If we double click on the animator controller, we can see that we can enter into a state here, but we need to create that animation. So click on the character, and then let's go to window, animation, animation window, and I'll drag this down here. So we need to create a animation clip for character 21. So click create, and then I will save this in the same folder as the animator controller. And let's just call this anim idle, hit save. Okay, so now we need to drag the frames for that animation here. So I will actually move this window up here next to the tile palette, and let's go find the art. Okay, so we get the character art here, and let's grab the animation frames. So let's see, it starts here and goes to here. So let's just drag those into the animation window, and these will all be sprites. So if I hit play, you'll see that we have the looping animation. It's going way too fast, so I'm going to turn down the samples to something like 15. And that will slow down our animation. So not really going to get into setting up the animator here, but you can see here that when the game launches, it's going to use this animator to determine which animation is playing. We created an animation, so it automatically made the entry point this anim.idle. So that's what you're seeing happen right here. The animator controller is just looping through that animation. You can see that the character here is quite big compared to this Tilemap Packs. So if you wanted to, you could just scale up the grid to be double the size so it fits this character better. So I'm going to take the cell size and make that 32, 32. And the way to make these tiles actually fit the grid now would be to go to the art, and I can click on the pack here, and I'll just take the pixels per unit and cut that in half to 50, hit apply. And that's kind of a cheap hack to double our tiles and still make it fit the grid. Probably the better alternative though would be to go back into Aseprite, and then for your pack, just export it with double the size. So when you go into Sprite, you can go to File, Export, and then resize to 200%. So that would double the size. You could do 300% to triple the size. So it doesn't always necessarily matter what detail you draw it at, as long as you can scale it up to your game. Or you can just use the trick that I showed you. So now if I go to grid and I'll right click on it and add a new tilemap 2D object, tilemap rectangular. So let's draw on tilemap 1 so that I can have this actually layer over the tilemap 0. And then on tilemap 0, let's just add in some more ground. And there you go. With different tile maps, you can combine your background tiles with things that sit on top of it, your objects. Though if you want things to be interactable beyond just being a collidable object, then you would need to actually make them into game objects. So that might be when you take some of your art, whether it's in a tile pack or not, you drag it out there, and then now it's a game object in your scene. So you could add things like a script. So new script, and then you could say something like trunk, and this would be a C+ file. So you can code it however you want a trunk to operate. Like if it gets hit with an axe, it turns into wood, whatever you need. Okay, so really the last thing is going to be, what if it's like a tree, right? So you drag out your tree piece, and because we're using it as a tile, it actually isn't going to show all of the art here all at once, which is kind of a problem. So if you just drag out those perfectly separated tiles in the 16 by 16, how do you get the larger object? Well, one way would be that you could export it as a separate thing from Unity and not split it into a separate object. But when you load it in the art, you would just keep it in sprite mode single, and then just have the whole tree be one single object instead of cutting it. So another way would be to jump into the sprite editor. So if we zoom in on here, you can create a new tile that just has all of this included at once. I'm going to left click and just drag a box roughly around the shape. Now I'm going to drag on the edges here Okay, and so I'm going to click on the box. I'm going to use the blue corners to just stretch this to the actual size of our tree. And I might also take the pivot point and move this down here so that when you're sorting items in the same sorting layer, they're going to sort depending on their Y value. So you want the Y value to be centered here. So basically, a character would compare if he's standing above or below the bottom of the tree, not the middle of the tree. Because if you think about this in terms of 3D, this would be the point if he's in front or back. Otherwise, you could have a character kind of standing right here, and he would show in front of this point where he really should be behind. So at some point, you may need to go in and customize the pivot points for the objects if you need to control where the character shows in front or back. So that's just that little circle there. So let's go ahead and apply that. This will create a new sprite. And so we can come down here and we'll see that down here. So I'm going to just drag this whole tree out as one object, and then we can delete that extra tree. So this tree object is all one sprite now. So even though we took it from a pack, which things are generally 16 by 16, this sprite has been customized in its size. So we can add a component, new script, and just determine how a tree should interact in our game world. But if you do think this is too messy of a way of doing things, then in Aseprite, what you can just do is export some of your objects separately as their own things. So I'll just grab this tree here. And so what I'll do to only export this as a separate thing is I'll go to Sprite and then crop. So this is the only thing remaining for right now. Make sure you don't Control S and override the file. Otherwise, if you do, you can just hit Control Z to undo that. But let's have it broken down into just this tree and then do File Export. And now I'll just give it a file name. So I'll just call it tree.png, same folder. Okay, Control Z, so you know the pack's still there. And let's look in the art folder. So now in art, we have the tree as its own separate thing. Sprite mode to multiple. Before I was doubling the size of it, so I didn't actually scale it up in Aseprite, though I could have. You know what though? Actually, let's do that because that's possibly better. So let's re-export it. I'm going to go to File, Export, and do 200% resize. Let's override that tree. Then in Unity, we can leave the pixels per unit as 100. We don't need to mess with that setting because now we're making the game at 32 by 32 pixels, kind of the tile size. So sprite mode single, filter mode point, compression none, apply it. It's a single frame, so we can just drag this out where we need it. And no slicing of a sprite map necessary. Okay, last thing I do want to quickly show is the pivot thing again. So if I click on the tree, let's go into the sprite editor actually, and let's move the pivot point down to the bottom. So if I take the player and I put him right here, or rather right down here, you can see that the player should be standing in front of the tree. But the sorting point of the player is right about here, and the tree sorting point is right about here. So we need to change those pivot points. I'm going to click on the tree, sprite editor. Let's move the pivot point where the center of the tree should be on the ground. Hit apply. So that's going to offset the tree's position a bit. But now the center point of the tree right here actually makes more sense. So let's correct the player as well so that its pivot point, where we're considering kind of the center point for where the character stands, is down here as well. So let's click on the character art, go to sprite editor, and let's slice again. Let's use method smart so that we try to adjust the old sprites without creating new ones. Hopefully that should help minimize the amount of work we need to do in like setting up the animator and that kind of thing. And then let's go to type. So let's change the pivot to custom. And then if we look in the bottom right hand corner, we can see the settings for the pivot. I want to kind of figure out where the feet are supposed to stand. So it's about those values of 0.5 and then probably 0.2 for the Y. So let's do slice. And I'm going to make the Y 0.2 custom. And then let's try grid by cell count again. I'll just do 13 by 4. And we want to have it in smart mode. Custom pivot 0.5.2. Okay, let's slice and let's see if that works for us. I'm going to hit apply. All of the characters have a pivot that's right there at its feet. Pretty good. Let's go back out. And now if we click on the character, we can see that it's adjusting its position based on where its feet are. Maybe I'm a little off. I could have made that a little bit lower, but it's much better. So the tree's center is right there at the base of its trunk, and the character's pivot is right there. Okay, if we take a look at game view, we can see that the pixel art, it's not really displaying correctly. So the way we solve this is that we need a pixel perfect camera. So I'm going to click on camera. I'm going to add component pixel perfect. So you should be able to find that, add that in. Okay, so now when the camera looks at the pixel art, it should display properly. So I'm going to change the free aspect to kind of match this reference resolution for now. We can see that the main camera is a little small. So I'm going to change the position of the camera. Let's go to scene view and make sure that it can actually see our scene. So let's drag it down there. Now in game view, we can see our player. May need to play around with the scaling size if you think that's too big for right now, but let's hit play and just take a look at it for a second. Okay, so our animation is playing, but you can see that the tree is still rendering in front of the player, so that's sort of a problem. So you're probably wondering, why does it still not sort two objects like the tree and the character based on their Y position and order in layer? So the order in layer works. So if I change the order in layer to 1, you can see that it shows in front, obviously, but they have the same value, default layer and order in layer. So the way we change that is we have to change the settings on the 2D universal render pipeline. So click on assets, and that is right here. I'm going to double click to. So if you created the project the same way I did, assets and then settings, and then you're going to have your universal RP right here. And we actually need to access the renderer 2D. So I can double click here, which is going to open this up. Same thing. And then we want to change the transparency sort mode here from default to custom axis and make sure that Y is the axis. So 0 for X, Y is a value of 1 because that's the one we're sorting on, and then Z is 0 as well. So if I take the character and I move him up now, you'll see that after it gets to a certain point, kind of the middle point of the tree, that it does disappear behind the tree. So it's kind of working, but not really. So the last thing we need to change is the sprite sort point for both the tree and the player. Click on the tree and make it pivot, and then click on the player and make it pivot. So now if I move the character up, you can see that it's going to be more appropriate because we're using the pivot point down here for the tree sorting. So if our character was to walk behind the tree, it would look like this, and in front of the tree, it's like this. And that's how you can Y-sort things that are on the same sorting layer. So good to keep in mind, especially if you want characters to be able to go behind houses or trees and stuff like that as well. So I know this went on for quite a while longer than I wanted to. I hope this answered all of the basic questions that anyone would want to understand about importing art into Unity and kind of making it look correct, using it for characters, and having it fit on a grid for tile maps, and having it look right by making a pixel perfect camera. Yeah, make sure that when you do render, you gotta have it at specific resolutions for it to look right. As long as it matches your aspect ratio, it should be okay. So if you were doing 16 by 9, you could do 1600 by 900. Then that should work. It should make the error message disappear. But yeah, I do appreciate everybody who watched to the end. Thanks for watching. I've been Chris, and I will see all of you in my future video content.